Doctor Who Short Trips The Parliament of Rats by Daniel O'Mahony. The Lung of Heaven was a good ship, solid and reliable. Carter Corzin had served on board for 40 years, more than half as captain, and it had remained trustworthy when all else around her proved treacherous. It was because she trusted the Lung that she allowed Constantine to take it off course. Lethe's winter was in its third phase and the mist was thick, the pressures of time on their surroundings constant, but the reassuring creak of the ship's hull persuaded Corzin to indulge her navigator. The crew didn't share her faith. They clustered on deck, muttering tales about gods of the sea and betting on the outcome of Constantine's excursion. Brunner, the priest-physician, looked on from a distance, his hands idly caressing the dull silver shaft of his staff. His impatience was a little more good-humoured and well-concealed. At the prow, Constantine too was alone. She stood with her back to the others, her arms raised and her palms splayed as though feeling for intangible shapes in the fog. Her antics unnerved the more superstitious sailors, though not quite as much as the translucent images that would flicker round her as she guided the Lung through the ghost mazes of the night. She was the smallest and oddest looking of the crew. Naturally dark-haired, she had used plant dyes to add long streaks of red, gold and green. "I can see it!" she trilled. "The box! It's really here!" She turned, flashing her jewel eyes at the crew. "It's in the sea! The blue box!" Corzin was the first to join her at the prow. Constantine stabbed at the sea, at a dark shape half submerged, just as she had dreamed. A hinge flap hung open, letting in the water. Corzin was surprised that the box hadn't gone under, and a lamp pulsed at its crest. There were bodies on the surface. 2 water-bloated humans. Corzin bit her lip. "They aren't dead," Constantine hissed sweetly. "Not yet." Corzin turned. Brunner was behind her, his incongruously bearded baby face planted in her way. He stammered, trying to speak. She eased him gently but firmly to one side and yelled out to the mate, "Kill the wind, Mr. Harbo, and prepare to receive boarders." There were only the 2. Harbo trawled for others until the female recovered and told them they were alone. She was another child, barely older than Constantine, but with a hardness in her face that bespoke an experience the navigator had never known. Her name, it seemed, was Nyssa. Her companion, a dust-blonde young man, was a doctor. Nyssa didn't know his name. Corzin wondered what it must have been like for Nyssa to see the prow of the Lung carved through the mist like a crusted, brine-stinking shadow. She hoped it was intimidating. Everyone deserved that frisson of fear. They were strange people, which did little for the crew's morale. The man's clothes, heavy with water when he was dragged aboard, were dry a minute later. The box was stranger still. Corzin had stuck her head through the door and paused thoughtfully for a while before asking Brunner to perform a rite of purging, and then sealing the box in the hold. By the evening both survivors had recovered, and were well enough to join her and Brunner for dinner in her cabin. It was the closest to opulence that existed on board. She arrived late, as was her habit, to find the doctor cradling the dome of his head in silent pain. He looked up as the captain entered, but did not stand. Nor did Nyssa, though Brunner wobbled slightly to attention. It didn't matter. Corzin had never enjoyed the rituals of discipline. "Ah, Captain," the doctor said. "I'm sorry if we've caused you any inconvenience." Basic courtesy, Corzin knew better than to answer. "You don't seem too well," she commented as she slid into her seat and started the attack on her food. She had never shaken off the need to eat fast and furiously against starvation. "So, Doctor," she asked at last, What exactly had been going on when we found you? The doctor, who was hardly touching his meal, looked up, his face a mask of discomfort and surprised guilt. "Ah, well," he said, "that may be—" "We're travellers," Nyssa cut across him bluntly. "From another planet. The TARDIS, our ship, was—" she paused, "brought down into the sea." Corzin was finding, to her surprise, that the girl was the voice of the couple. She hadn't worked out what the doctor was yet. Maybe the heart. The doctor seemed mortified, embarrassment outstripping his pain. He exchanged soft words with his companion, too soft for Corzin to pick up. "But doctor," Nyssa said, "you've always told me that—" "Enough," Corzin said firmly. "We must look rustic, but we know what goes on up there." She jabbed a hard brown finger towards the ceiling, towards the sky. "Good, good," the doctor said, his voice slipping as his brow creased with renewed pain. "I think you're suffering," Brunner made to begin a dreadful warning diagnosis. "You need to lie down," Corzin interjected, rising. She helped the doctor up, leading him out and through the cramped passages towards the cabin she had set aside for him. "This is very kind of you," he murmured, almost an apology. Corzin watched as he sank into a peaceful stupor. His body wasn't still, so her guess had been right. He wasn't remotely human. "Lethe, this planet is called," Nyssa told him. She shrugged. "In one human mythology," the doctor explained airily, "the dead drink from the waters of the river Lethe to regenerate themselves, but are reborn without memories of their past lives." "I see," Nyssa responded, sounding harsher than she had intended. The doctor was struggling not to seem fragile, but he was less practiced at disguise than he had once been. He held his head as though it were new and too heavy. The darkness around his eyes betrayed him. He didn't seem to want kindness. Nyssa restricted herself to imparting the scant information that she had learned about Lethe. "This is an ocean world," she reported. "The humans, their descendants, are island-based. Lethe doesn't have the resources to support a high-technology society." "So?" the doctor prompted. Speaking was painful for him. "So, something else must have disrupted the TARDIS. It might even have been a natural phenomenon, I think," she added, smiling with pride at her own deductions. "It could be a localized time-space distortion." "Yes," the doctor agreed softly, his hands at his temples again. "That girl, the navigator, the one with the hair, I think she must be a time-sensitive, steering a course through striations in the time fields on this planet. I can't imagine someone like Corzin tolerating her otherwise. She was the one who tracked us when we crashed. We owe her our lives." Nyssa breathed heavily. The cabin's air seethed with a hissing dust. The doctor lapsed into silence, his fingers steepled in thought. Nyssa guessed what he was mulling over, in the easy moments between pain. If Constantine was time-sensitive, and she was beyond doubt, then she could only be the outcome of slow generations of exposure to unfixed time. The doctor had more than generations behind him. The distortion was in his eyes, his slumped posture. It was in his head, and it was eating him. He was more of a time-sensitive than Constantine could ever be. Nyssa had never thought of the doctor as a good navigator. "Do they know about it?" the doctor mused. Nyssa wasn't sure whether this was a question for her or a carelessly slipped thought. "I don't think so," she said. "They need sensitives to travel long distances, but they react to it. They don't understand it. Brunner was telling me. I think he likes you," the doctor said absently. Nyssa clicked her tongue and stared at him, wondering what to make of this. She wasn't deceived by the youth of his new body. When she had first met him, when he was another man, he had been packed with resentful energy that anticipated age even as it crept across him. His regeneration had weakened him badly. "When Corzin took you away," she began again, "Brunner was telling me a bit about his mission. He's chartered this ship. Apparently he's an agent of the Lethean rulers. He didn't say that much. He's very shy. She almost said secretive, but checked herself. The doctor gestured for her to go on. His hand sank after the effort. His masters are on a crusade against superstition, she reported. The approval in her voices, real and inner, was warm and thoroughly Trakanite. Brunner is trying to stamp out the worship of a sea deity called the White God. The doctor's thin lips twitched. A bit difficult for one man. The interesting thing, Nyssa continued, is the legend of the Parliament of Rats. It's a pirate ship that supposedly captured the White God, who cursed them, as gods do, and they sailed into a fog 100 years ago, never to be seen again. Brunner is trying to find the ship to expose the legend. Do you think he'll succeed? The doctor asked. His voice was alert despite his condition. He already knew her answer. If the Parliament of Rats is temporally displaced, then the chances of anyone finding it are negligible. What are its chances of finding us? He asked wryly. Any answer was preempted by Corzin, who rapped sharply on the door before entering. Her face seemed carved from the same wood as her ship, not at all softened by the dark sweep of her hair, and her eyes flickered, constantly watching. I should warn you that women are not allowed in men's cabins during the night, she said. Nyssa's quarters proved to be a cramped bunk room below deck, whose walls ached with the knowledge that there were only thin planks holding back the ocean and death by drowning. It was already occupied. The wounded doctor was a solid rock compared with Constantine. This was the first time that Nyssa had been close to the navigator. Before, from a distance, she'd been a splash of colour, brilliant enough to illuminate her grim environment. At close range she became drabber, the natural tone of her skin and the grime of her clothes deadening the streamers of her hair. She was still liquid, though, smiling dreamily. "Hello, Nyssa. Would you mind doing me up?" Constantine's wrists were strung from a coil of rope. Another knot round her ankle was already tightened, digging into her flesh. Nyssa felt sick. "This is my idea." Constantine could have been talking to herself. "I might hurt myself if I walk and dream together. I might turn metal baby blue, precious white metal on my lips where it won't rust. What's that called?" she murmured. "Platinum," Nyssa murmured. "That's right, Nyssa of dead Traken." At that, Nyssa found herself pulling the knot as tight as she could. Constantine squealed between giggles, then fell asleep soon after, strung up like a side of cold abattoir meat. Nyssa stripped off the sackcloth that the crew had given her and clambered onto the top bunk. The mattress was a living thing stuffed with straw and insects. In the space before she slept, she pondered what she had learned about the planet Lethe. But it was not her problem, she knew. Not yet. The doctor wore his new body like a scar. Since his regeneration, he had become both less and more concerned by the worlds he travelled through, both distant and protective. What was going through his head? The question kept her tense and awake for a while. When she eventually slept, she dreamt of the death of planets and of an oblivion that ate through suns. Constantine howled. Nyssa jerked upright and peered over the edge of the bunk. She saw that the girl was scrabbling at the coarse rope bindings, her wrists raw and bleeding as she struggled. Her eyes were transfixed, her mouth twisted. "There is a black ship!" Constantine howled into her face. "The rats are coming to eat our eyes! Out! Out of the fog!" "It's in your dreams." "Oh, yes," Constantine crooned, "but not for much longer." The navigator's clothes stank of urine. Nyssa almost gagged. "All right," she murmured. "You can tell Corzin. I'll take you." Still dozy, she set to work on freeing the grinning, shrieking girl. The doctor usually slept easily when he bothered to, but in the creaking wood cage of the Lung of Heaven he couldn't manage it. The pain in his head made him drowsy but kept him from sliding into oblivion. Fear, too, kept him awake. Nissa's guess about time fractures had been right, but that kind of distortion shouldn't have a physical effect. Unable to settle, he left his cabin. The ship rocked gently and he rocked with it. He felt as though he were flying as he moved, the seething floor an illusion beneath his feet. He wasn't sure who to turn to. Not Nissa, who would worry. Not Corzin, who consciously isolated herself. Not any other member of the crew, who would only tolerate him at best. He also discounted Constantine, with whom he had so much and so little in common. Time Lords and Time Sensitives did not mix well, the one rigid, unemotional and certain, the other fluid, volatile and transient. That left Brunner, who was a physician, and held out the hope of a painkiller that might not burst his hearts. Brunner's cabin was a mess, strewn with papers and clothes. The man himself was gone, though his bed covers were ruffled. The metal staff he had clasped all through dinner was lying across his bed. The doctor's head burned. There was no one here to help him. He considered waiting. It crossed his mind to clear up. Something was wrong with the room. It wasn't simply a mess. It was a parody of order and demanded his attention. He lifted the staff so he could sit and think. It flared silver white, an ice blaze rising along its length and searing his eyes. The metal coiled and writhed in the warmth of his hand, a steel serpent walking. No, he realized, not steel. His hands opened. The staff, dull again, leapt across the room and clattered into the corner. Violent fear overcame his pain, and he careered out of the cabin, making for the deck. The air outside was white and soaking and made the world invisible. In the fog he smashed into a passing body and reeled. "Doctor," Corzin said silkily. Her hard, mocking features solidified out of the mist. "You're looking much better." "Captain," he blustered, "you must tell me what Brunner is doing on this ship. I'm afraid he's putting us all at risk." "Yes," she said, "he is." She knew then. "What is he doing?" the doctor insisted. "I believe," Corzin responded haltingly, "that he is the appointed official god-killer of the autarky. He roots out and destroys rivals to our own precious Om. He's good, I'm told, at his job." A horn blared out of the night. The doctor started. "I remember this," Corzin whispered. The mist softened her words further, making them almost inaudible. She was shaking. I'd hoped he was wrong. Still trembling, she shot a look off to one side. The doctor's eyes followed. The wet cotton mist was easing where they looked, thinning into a white film over the night. A line of denser darkness cut across the sky, a shadow mass ploughing the ocean bearing towards them. It was another ship, though the mist stripped it of its outline, turning it into an oncoming chunk of shapeless night. Corzin shuddered, a hand fluttering to her face. "We should go below." The doctor nodded, but she was already away, darting down a gangway, the wooden steps rattling as she went. The doctor followed her, recognizing the tension urgent in her body. "Captain Corzin," the doctor called, following the bobbing smear of an oil lamp in her hand. "Yes?" her voice came from somewhere ahead. "The other ship. Is it the Parliament of Rats?" There was no response beyond a concentrated, deliberate smash and the splitting of wood. Then her voice came again. "There's been a Captain Corzin on the lung of heaven since before the Parliament disappeared," she said. "I'm the last. I want the name to die with me. But not today. Catch." The light flew at him. He caught it in both hands and held on though it burned his palms. Corzin came out of the gloom, spectral in the flicker and stink of the oil flame. She had a gun, an automatic pistol. It was, the doctor guessed, a working antique. "May the white god deliver us from evil," she said, "or grant us some little mercy. Amen." The doctor's lips twitched. Now he understood. The lung of heaven heaved under the impact. The ship's walls lurched sideways and flung Nissa to the floor. She'd been helping Constantine along the passageway, but now the navigator caught her, tucking stick-thin arms around her shoulders and lifting her clear. "The black ship," Constantine said, bitter and satisfied. Her seaweed hair drooped over her face. She pointed at a nearby porthole, where a hard mass of black wood was visible, thumping patiently on the Lung's hull. "They could have smashed us to bits," Nyssa observed, still calculating even as she nursed her bruised ribs. "They don't want to," Constantine purred. Her face swam before Nyssa's as though it were a reflection in the water. "They'll be boarding now. The rat men," she added, making an odd twitch with her free arm. The ship's hull beat with a tattoo of thumps. A dirty palm flattened onto the thick porthole glass, sharp nails scratching for entry. Nyssa recoiled. Constantine's grin was a ragged score on her lips. They moved on quickly, leaving the invader to scrabble fruitlessly on the outside of the ship. Meanwhile, the Lung's crew had blossomed in the passages, and the going became heavier as muscular, alert bodies surged around them. Obviously everyone knew about the black ship now. Habu pushed through the crush, pulling a massive brunner in his wake. The little priest was calmer than Nyssa had seen him before, the blackness of his clothes wasting into the night. One thing gave him away, the fluster of his fingers round the head of his staff. His lips twitched, a silent prayer. Habu's eyes were frosted and still. Nyssa shouted questions at him, but he shrugged them off. He was concentrating on the situation in hand and wanted the civilian insects kept together and out of the way. Nyssa turned her attention to the priest, seeing a fat, smug smile on his face. His head rocked from side to side. He was awake and dreaming. "We have a weapon," he said cheerfully. "It is the truth." Nyssa realised then that Brunner was mad, madder than Constantine, who had slumped to the floor in a fit of giggles. The sailors were clattering onto the decks, their boots stamping over planks that were Nyssa's ceiling. She wondered for the first time where the doctor was. He would be either in the thick of the action or far beneath it, lost in a problem of his own. That would turn out to be the important one, she guessed. There was shooting in the distance, muffled by thick layers of wood. Nyssa suddenly wished that the doctor was here. A human shape emerged from the gloom and shambled towards them. Constantine sniggered, and Brunner stared confidently. Nyssa dug her teeth into her lower lip. It was not the doctor. It was nothing like the doctor at all. The boarder was a tortured man. Nyssa was intrigued rather than shocked by his deformities. A cold kernel of curiosity forced her to study the gargoyle architecture of his skull with interest rather than disgust. He had one jaundiced eye, while the other was pierced by sharp bone fingers. Layers of skin that rotted scentless and hung on his shuddering bones. His flesh was red and sore, but clean, Nyssa realised, and undiseased. A necklace of pulsing sacs hid his collar and shoulder bones. His hair was combed neatly over his mottled scalp. He had a gun, and it was pointed at them. There were others, all with guns, all with treacherous bodies. None tried to speak, which was a blessing. As they herded their mute captives onto the deck, Nyssa found herself brooding over their deformities again. Exposure to temporal radiation, she guessed, from charting a ship through the time winds. "I'm not very good with people," Constantine confessed at her ear, but was silenced by a gun butt. Most of the Lung's crew were on deck, men kneeling in line for prayer with their palms clapped impotently on their heads. The pirates of the Parliament of Rats shone glaring beacons at them that cut the fog. Behind them, moored off the prow of the Lung, was the dark Parliament itself. Nyssa didn't bother following its outline, but concentrated on its texture. It seemed a stain of dark matter from under the surface of the white world. There was no sign of Corzin or the doctor. She spotted Harbo kneeling with the rest of the crew and broke ranks to address him. He turned his head to regard her with baleful fish eyes. "We surrendered," he said, "as the captain would have wanted." He might have spat then. His left arm was slashed open, but if he was in pain, he wasn't showing it. Nyssa looked closer, but before she could get near him, a large alien hand snatched her hair and dragged her away. The fingers were wet hot and waxy on her scalp. More molten fingers picked her shoulder and shoved her away from the praying, bleeding mate. She slumped back onto the deck. "Not Captain," slurred her attacker. His voice came from the muffling collar of his long-jewelled coat, from beneath the brim of his gold-trimmed tricorn, from the hole where his face was hidden. It was a male voice, but with a breathless quality that seemed mockingly feminine. Nyssa guessed from his elaborate costume that he was in charge. "Want Lung, Captain. Want Corzin." Pale in the shadow of his own ship, and the hug of the translucent mist, he was pathetic. Nyssa wanted to giggle. She wanted to take the muffler from his face to see what it was like, to see whether it was more or less decayed than those of the rest of the crew. "In Captain Corzin's absence," Brunner called, unusually clear and authoritative, "I take full responsibility for this ship." The captain of the Parliament of Rats stamped a foot and snorted impatiently. He raised a gnarled finger to the shadow of his mouth. "Priest," he grunted, dismissing him. The finger swayed, pointing tentatively at Brunner, at Constantine, at Harbo, before stabbing confidently at Nyssa. "God food," the captain said. "For white God." He tried to laugh, but the milky rasp died away in a cough. The captain was dying. All the pirates were dying. Suddenly, unable to fear them, Nyssa realized how pitiful they were, how tiny. They were more like parasites on the body of the Lung than its conquerors. The black, obliterating bulk of the Parliament suddenly seemed more forbidding than its puppets. "Captain!" Brunner stepped forward, moving determinedly alongside Nyssa. He no longer seemed insane. The confrontation had lent him steel. The pirate had noticed as well and hobbled closer. Brunner flinched, though barely, and drove the hard point of his staff onto the deck. "Priest," the captain hummed. "Yes," the priest acknowledged. There was a game going on here that Nyssa couldn't fathom. "God food," the captain sneered. "Yes," Brunner responded evenly. He touched Nyssa's shoulder. "Instead of her," he added. The captain's finger rose again and twitched. "As well," he rasped. "Instead," Brunner repeated, but it was too late. The Parliament's other puppets were already detaching themselves from the fog to take them, their skin glistening and their lamps hissing. Nyssa felt flesh on her hand and recoiled, but it was only Brunner squeezing her fingers into his own podgy grip. "Don't be frightened," he whispered. "I can't," she replied, shaking her head frantically as her lip twisted. "How can I be frightened?" "Feed to white God," their captor snarled, his finger now jabbing at the shadow hull behind him. "Feed to the rats." For an hour they hid in the hold, in a tight compartment between bulkheads that Corzin had no difficulty in locating in the dark. She had extinguished the lamp as soon as they heard the first thumps of boarders leaping onto the hull. The doctor could see her smile in the dark, as a crescent of white with gold flecks. She had extraordinarily keen senses for a human. They were silent as the boarders combed the hold. Only when the last footfalls had died away, leaving just the natural stretch and yawn of the Lung's timbers, did Corzin take the pistol barrel from between the doctor's ribs and let him speak. "Don't you think your crew might need you?" "They've orders to give up the ship. No violence. It was Brunner's idea." "And Brunner's paying?" There was no answer to that, beyond the hiss of her breath and the soft rustle of her hair. "Then why are we hiding?" the doctor asked, innocently, without force. "Because I'm the captain," she said. "Because I'm Corzin, and because Brunner doesn't know what that means. I'll give him enough time to get on to the Parliament. Then we can go." "Good," the doctor murmured. "I'm getting a cramp." "Lucky you're a doctor, then," was the last he heard from her until she decided it was time to go. As she expected, there was a pirate guard at the hold. She levelled her gun and shot him before the doctor could protest. A black flower bloomed halfway up the pirate's corkscrew spine, and he fell. Corzin strutted callously away. The doctor, appalled, knelt by the body. His eyes misted over, softening the sight of death and the deformities that the pirate had carried in life. The corpse was odourless and seemed to deflate as its brine blood gushed onto the deck. Curious, the doctor put his hand to the dead flesh and found it soft and rippling. Somewhere far away Corzin was shouting, her voice rattling through the skeleton of the lung. The doctor left the dead pirate leaking outside the hold and set off after her. "Pym," Corzin was calling. "Captain Pym of the Parliament of Rats." He arrived in time to see her being hauled through a deck hatch by string-thick but powerful arms. She saw him flit from the shadows and offered him a confident grin. Something about her manner made him hold back until after her boots had vanished through the gap, as if it were a command. Only then did he struggle up the short steps after her. He poked his head cautiously through the deck, glancing from side to side to make sure that none of the boarders could see him. The pirates were clustered around Corzin, but not too close. She was forceful and determined, and they were too brittle to stand in her way. She strode through the subdued, crouched forest of sailors towards the deck heart. Here the swaddled but imposing figure of the pirate leader was waiting. This, the doctor assumed, was Captain Pym. "You, Corzin?" Pym growled. His voice was too sticky sweet to convey menace, and his rival seemed unfazed. Although he couldn't be sure, the doctor imagined a stern, sympathetic smile had settled on Corzin's mouth. "Yes," she shrugged, "the last." "Corzin!" "By right of conquest," said the woman fervently. "It's my right to be captain." A muffled snigger rose from the captain of the Parliament. His crew's mauled bodies rippled uneasily. Corzin stood, figurehead still at the centre. She was a caged animal, tense and savage and patient. It was hard to guess who was in charge at the heart of the deck. "Hi down there!" Constantine's upside-down head dropped out of the sky before the doctor's eyes, her vermilion gold jade hair streaming deckwards, her crescent moon face blocking his view of the confrontation. She was smiling so thoroughly that, inverted, it turned into a fierce and crooked scowl. Hungry eyes glittered, and the doctor had the unnerving feeling she was looking at many things more than him. "This is exciting, isn't it?" she babbled. "This is what she wants." The doctor tried to shush her. "Don't worry, they won't pay us any attention. I know, they're all a bit mad after all the time in the black ship. I know," she insisted. "I want to hear what she's saying," the doctor hissed. "Oh," the girl mouthed, eyes flashing frantic apologies. Her head bobbed out of the way, but the doctor couldn't forget the orbital presence over his head and its childish, excited breathing. The two captains were the centre of everyone's attention now. The sailors of the Lung knelt around them in sullen prayer. The sailors of the Parliament were a cluster of humble penitents. Corzin had grown larger, it seemed, or the fog had opened to make more room for her. The other captain was diminished, shrinking into the folds of his coat. Corzin was suddenly the more monstrous. "No, Bori Corzin," Pym coughed, almost in apology. "Dead, long dead," Corzin said plaintively, "with rust through his heart, like his sons and their sons." Her voice was too calculated to be genuine. Pym pushed his invisible head into the malformed cradle of his fingers. 100 years, it slurred from behind its mesh of thin skin and bone. Corzin nodded. 100 years. The pirate captain swung his head from side to side, and the doctor caught a hint of its shape, not much, but enough to raise doubts and questions. He craned his head up to find Constantine still beaming down at him. "There'll be fighting soon, and blood and blood and blood, and it'll be joy!" She kicked the last word into a squeal. The doctor forced out a hard glare. "Where is Nyssa?" he asked. Constantine raised her little fingers to her teeth, where they picked awkwardly. This was a bad sign. "You take," Pym was saying, his crooked little fingers picking at the bullet hole on Corzin's coat. "You make us free again." "Where is she?" The doctor's eyes scanned the ranks of sailors, the backs of 24 shaved heads. There was no sign of Nyssa's ample brown curls, nor for that matter could he see Brunner. "Yes," Corzin said, far away and meaningless. "I make you free." "Where is she?" the doctor barked into the waif's guilt-swelled face. Corzin's hand came up and it was full and spoke, and the top of Pym's head came away in a scarlet spattered shower. Constantine quivered and her mouth opened. The explanation poured out and the doctor's hearts froze. A scattering of the pirate crew sagged, as if resigned to death. Corzin put bullets into the closest, then ducked behind the still staggering cadaver of her first victim, as his more belligerent comrades returned fire. There was ample meat left in Pym's body to stop their shots. They were slow and clumsy and open, while Corzin, quick, lithe and protected, took out more of them. As their guns fell, the Lung's crew snatched them and joined their captain in a bloody rout. Constantine watched and cooed. The doctor paid little attention. He was already running for the edge of the deck, for a line across the water, for the obsidian bulk of the Parliament of Rats. The pirates blindfolded them when they were taken aboard the Parliament. Nyssa felt certain that she would remember her path through the invisible labyrinth, but the journey proved too complex and too long. She began to suspect that she wouldn't live to have her sight restored. She was surprised when the blindfold came off. Brunner was still with her, blinking in the one light of the Parliament below decks. His staff was an awkward baby in his arms. The pirates had tried to take it from him, but had given up when unable to prise his locked fingers from its shaft. Their captors led them down into the bowels of the ship and placed them together in a cabin whose walls were smeared with weed and brine and worse. Their escorts left quickly, a dissatisfied pinch of silence round them as they lurched back through the cabin door. It locked before Nyssa could reach it. She glanced round their cell, seeing no furniture and no decoration except for a stretched mirror against one wall. The reversed Nyssa she saw there paced and brooded, barely containing her energies. Brunner's mirror counterpart seemed wispy on the surface of the glass. The genuine article was imposing and dominant by comparison. She shrugged. What now? "Why aren't you scared?" Brunner said simply. She stared at him. He took a practiced step backwards. "You look scared," he said, "except in your eyes. It doesn't convince you, does it?" She shook her head. "The doctor doesn't understand." "I might," Brunner said easily. The doctor had been right. He did like her. Even so, she had to think carefully before answering. "I'm tired of being frightened, that's all. I feel exhausted by it all. I've seen too much. I've lost too much," she finished in an emotionless tone. "I've been wrung dry." Brunner nodded, a scrawny fringe of black creeping over his domed head. He seemed gentle and pathetic and funny, and she laughed at him. He didn't seem to mind. He seemed no more frightened than she did. Behind her the mirror growled. Brunner's eyes gleamed. The staff came forward in his hands. Nyssa turned. Her reflection was melting into Brunner's. The mirror Nyssa became a strange sharer of ghost flesh. Their false bodies seeped together and their heads locked into a single skull. If she showed any distress, it didn't register on the face of the glass. Her reflection grinned instead, with half a mouth and one blazing eye. The colour smeared to the edges of their body, leaving them bleached. The surface of the mirror pulsed and bulged. The mono creature at its heart was stepping forward, struggling to become free. "The white god," Brunner said calmly. The staff was rigid in his hands. "He's going to fight it," she realised. The passion was naive but determined in his features. Nissa made for the door, rattling its handle but finding it frustratingly solid. "Don't worry," Brunner warned her, the calm insanity easing back into his tone. It was in the staff. He carried his madness round with him as his weapon. "It can't stand against the truth," he added blithely. Nissa dealt the hard door a thump from her shoulder, but it held fast.
"I knew that it was going to go wrong. I knew it, but I didn't see it for a long time because I was watching all the shooting and all the things on the deck with the blood. I made the blood all myself. Maybe that's why it was a bit strange. I don't know who he is. Even when I looked in his head, I couldn't see everything because he has a huge mind. I don't know how he fits it all in a tiny head. They call themselves Time Lords, his people, which is funny. I don't know who he is, really. Being a doctor is a disguise. I saw the clowns when I was a girl with my sister at my side, and he was one of them. A parade of clowns. He thought about me while I was thinking about him. Snap, but he's right. He can't see. The Lord of Time can't see. Time smashes to bits. Crash, bang. He can't see on the Parliament of Rats because he was right. Because we are different. He belongs in a straight world of sense and order, and I'm giggling, dribbling, drooling down a maze of things possible. It must have scared him to be in those passages lost. I might have warned him not to go. But he was worried about Nissa, who might be hurt and is kind. So when the fighting was getting boring because blood and guts everywhere are boring, especially when you've only made them up yourself, I sent a bit of me across into the ship, floating through the maze of time and death to catch him before he turned blue as the sea in a second summer. He was on his knees, and I was crying, and I've heard crying like that before. He looked at the bit of me I sent him. I must have been an angel to him, floating in the air, in my halo with my head twisting, or something like an angel, but not an angel. "I can't see," he said, and he was crying. Actually, I'm not sure if he saw me at all. "I can't find her." Oh, he was begging. "I can't find my way." So I gave him my hand because he made me sad. "It's that thing," I said, "the opposite of bad. I can show you the way."
A trail of flailing membranes followed the white god, umbilical cords that linked it to the dense silver mirror that spawned it. Nissa slashed at the nearest and severed them. The god was undisturbed. It grew and sang as it grew, a babble of many voices bleeding into one. There was no menace in it, but she knew it would consume them dispassionately once they were in reach. It no longer had their shape or any shape. It was white, perfect and unstained and terrible. Framed against it, pale Brunner seemed dusty by comparison, every textured line of his skin visible against the immaculate white. He struck it ineffectually with the point of his staff, and bristled with frustration when this had no effect. "Truth!" he cried, striking pointlessly again. "Truth and order!" Nissa rattled the door again helplessly. The key was still in the lock, but out of her reach. She lost interest in the effort. There didn't seem to be any point. Brunner skipped backwards to avoid the encroaching crush of the creature. He inclined his head away, appealing to Nissa with baffled eyes. "It isn't working," he said, stumbling numb over the words. Nissa took the staff from him and flexed it. "What is it supposed to do?" "It's worked before," he said blandly. "It should kill it. It should kill it so thoroughly it would never have existed." He turned his head to the god, which was wide and large enough now to push them against the wall, a breath away from physical contact. Brunner's face blanched in the blaze, the whiteness enhancing his hatred and revulsion. "Abomination!" he spat brutally and cast his head down, expecting the end. Nissa looked away from him into the swollen, incorporeal god, finding it less appalling than Brunner did. He suddenly seemed distant and pointless, stripped of all his life and sharp humanity by the clarity of the being that unfolded before them. The godlight caught every one of its wretched tears and set it sparkling. She had more, wanted more, in common with the god than she did with Brunner. She put her fingers into the outermost edge of the glow. To her surprise, they remained cold, solid, and uneaten. It wouldn't harm her, even as it absorbed her. Braving a moment's blindness, she stared further into the depths and saw a cosmos forming in its heart, nebula dust coalescing into suns and stars, spitting forth new planets and life. Not a god then, but something close, something better. A white hole, a womb breeding universes. No, the doctor's firm voice said in her ear, it isn't that either. His sudden appearance broke the allure, and she pulled her undamaged hand free of its light. His young face was a worn crag, and his eyes were stinging red. He had the key in his hand, the door frame behind him, and Constantine's eager head bobbing carelessly over his shoulder. She was grinning and pointing wildly into the maelstrom. "Wow!" was all she could say. She said it again and again. The doctor put his hand on Nissa's shoulder. "Come on," he said. "I'll see to this. Constantine will show you the way back to the lung," he added coolly. "Corzin should have the pirates under control by now." His face wrinkled, revealing a deeper pain than a headache. Brunner was already making for the door, retreating from the slow forward creep of the white hole. Nissa's eyes stabbed at him, making him a coward. She felt bad about that later, but not yet. Not quite yet. "Could you leave the staff?" the doctor asked. Brunner nodded and laid it on the floor as the doctor continued. "I don't think it works the way you wanted. I think it's amplifying all this." He cast his eyes to the floor where the mundane metal stick lay, then into the light, staring unblinking into the fierce white firestorm. "Will you be all right?" Nissa asked, clutching protectively at his shoulder. "Oh yes," he replied brightly. "There's no danger here, just history." Brunner and Constantine were already shuffling her out of the door. The last she saw of the doctor before it closed, trapping him in the cabin with the roaring, hungry white god, was him leaning to pick Brunner's staff from the floor. He was ancient, his false young body hurting as he bent, but he wasn't feeble. His eyes had been vital. Constantine skipped ahead, her vibrant colours leading them easily through the dark guts of the Parliament of Rats. Tears sparked unwanted in Nissa's eyes. They left fat smears down her face. Brunner tried to comfort her, squeezing the bones of her hand. "He'll be all right," the priest-physician whispered. "He said it." "Yes," she said, "I believe him. I believe him." "Call me the doctor." He speaks to the staff, the living metal in his hand. "My lord?" "It was you in my head. It was you who brought down the TARDIS." "My lord," says the staff. "When I sensed you close, I had to reach out. We were conceived as the ultimate defence for Gallifrey, and we served well. It was not our destiny to be abandoned like roadside trash. We need orders, my lord." "I'm sure you do. You weren't the only thing the Time Lords left behind." "No, Lord. Lords like yourself did great things on this rock, but they are now gone to dust. Such is our destiny. O Lord, it is wonderful to touch the clean purity of your DNA. These human creatures smell. Their flesh stinks. They are not like us." "No, they aren't. It is demeaning to be a slave to them and their callow whims. I structure, I rationalise, I find weaknesses in the fabric and bind them tight, and they confound me. They use us to pursue crusades of superstition. We did not do that. They use us to shore up their own empires. We did not do that. No, we didn't, of course. And their children have fed on our trash relics and grown into beast things like the female who has tormented us. They are unclean in space, and they become unclean through time, and it's our fault." Yes, there's no need to shout. This white god is of your creation? We were made to draw it from the structure. It is a living thing, a white hole from the old times when such things were allowed. We can barely control it. It stands on the threshold of the event horizon and will become too real soon. Give us orders and we will push it back into the Shadowlands, where it will not exist. Now that's fascinating. You know, white holes also contain the event horizon. Theoretically, this is, Lord, there is no time. Hardly. There's too much. I can't do much about it. My lord, I must have orders. Very well, dissolve. Unbind your DNA. Cease to be Validium. Everything you created shall become water and spread out across the world and forget. You cannot order me to die. I can. Isn't that terrible? I would do anything to be free of that. My lord? I would lie. One day I might, but not to you. You can't be fooled. No, my lord. Then obey my orders. Yes, my lord. I'm sorry. Yes, my lord doctor. And the staff turns to water and dribbles through his fingers. Corzin was helping Nyssa clamber over the rails onto the lung when the ebony hulk of the Parliament was broken open and began to blast streams of dark water across the sea. It had drifted too far to strike the lung, but the howl of the gushers shook her, as if her god was screaming in pain. Murmurs on the deck behind her made her turn. The piled bodies of the boarders were dissolving into frothy salt liquid. In her arms, Nyssa was struggling as she saw the Parliament dissolve. "Doctor!" she howled. "Doctor!" Corzin hauled her aboard and let Brunner help her. The priest would be kinder, she knew, but she offered a smile of bitter encouragement. The doctor was already out of the door when the white god split open. The walls of the Parliament were breaking apart before he was in the corridor. The ship's timbers crashed around him, no less violent or heavy for coming in torrents of water. He tried to throw himself out of the way, but the water came relentlessly and smashed him down. The Parliament of Rats sank around him. Invisible weights pulled him into the smothering dark as his clothes and skin were drenched. The thick salt waters of Lethe clutched at him. He conserved the air in his body as he sank, his instinct to survive overruling the yearning desire to open his lungs and swallow and forget. It would be easy to float away. Calm hands dropped onto his shoulders and seized and pulled upwards, or downwards, he could hardly tell. Legs kicked powerfully into the water at his back. He broke the surface of the water sooner than he had expected. Constantine's drenched head broke through the water soon after, close enough to be made out through the thickening mist. Her hair was matted onto her head, revealing the crude, lumpy shape of her skull. Her teeth scored her face. She spat ocean. "Why?" the doctor gasped as his breath returned. "Why did you do it?" "You're a nice person," she said, floating unconcernedly with her face projecting through the scum surface of the sea. "I wouldn't let you die." "No?" He kicked to stay afloat. Constantine looked playful and ashamed. "You mean the pirates and the god and the ships and everything?" "Yes," he kicked again. His legs were ice cold and softening. "It was what everyone wanted," the navigator purred. "Corzin and Brunner have so many gaps in them. I filled them a bit, just a bit. The staff helped. I could make it do so many things by thinking. There are so many unmade worlds I can see that I can make. I took the ship from one. Oh, and the god. The god came from a huge empty world, a great big sucked hollow world." She clapped, setting a spray of water fluttering into the mist. "You shouldn't do things like that," the doctor warned, the ice water sloshing over his chin. "You're virtually rebuilding the universe from the foundations up, and you shouldn't be able to. It was the staff that gave you the power." "I didn't make the staff, my lord doctor," Constantine mewed. Cramp stabbed through the bone and muscle of his legs. "I never did a thing for myself," Constantine whined guiltily. No. A horn blared out of the fog, not the animal howl of the Parliament, but the real call of the lung of heaven. Turning his head, the doctor saw it. Its prow was a shadow visible through the veil of the mist, and as the sound of the horn died away, the doctor heard calls from the distant deck. "There! He's there! I can see!" Constantine's voice. The doctor kicked round to confront the woman in the water, in time to see the multiple bodies flickering around her outline, in time to see the water seethe to fill the gap as her body form collapsed into nothing. He lay silent, cold and thoughtful, on the surface of the sea, until Corzine herself came down to help him out. The Lung of Heaven sailed into port 5 days later. By that time, Nyssa felt she was on a new ship. Corzine had changed, slightly. Nyssa noticed that she talked more openly with Harbo and the crew, and a closeness had crept into their regular meals with Brunner. One morning Nyssa caught her smiling without irony or rancour. That was a good morning. The tenor of the ship changed with its captain. At one meal, Corzine had spoken of the strength and security she drew from the tiny sounds of the lung around her, and had been mildly surprised when both Brunner and Nyssa understood. Constantine had locked herself away. She stood at the prow on difficult days and turbulent nights, guiding the lung with curt, barked orders. She spent the rest of her time in her cabin and said nothing. Nyssa watched her on the deck one day, surprised by her coldness. The colour was bleeding unattended from her hair. The doctor too had retreated to his cabin. Nyssa visited him occasionally, but only once asked him when they would be leaving. He looked at her with ancient, contemplative eyes and sighed. "When I make up my mind," he said. He didn't confess his problem to her until the night before they sailed into port. She had to coax him, but as he spoke she realised how much he needed her to help him make the decision. "It's not our problem," she said as he finished. He nodded. "It is. The Time Lords made her, or their wreckage did. She understands what she can do. Even without the staff, He caught a glimpse of Nyssa's sceptical, spiked expression. "I made her," he insisted. "So what are you going to do?" Nyssa prompted blandly. "I think we have to take her with us," he said, "if she agrees." Nyssa gave a grim nod, silently pleased. With Corzine's permission they went to Constantine's cabin the following morning to ask the girl. Nyssa had left her bound and remembered the waif's hostile and intelligent face peering out from under her shock of hair. The rope was still locked tight around the bunk when she returned, but the navigator herself had melted into air. "Should we search the ship?" Nyssa asked. "No," the doctor responded. "Somehow I don't think there'd be any point." He looked at his hands, at his flat palms, as if they were dirty and repellent. His voice was dull. "This isn't our problem," Nyssa said. "No." The doctor shook his head wistfully. "Not anymore."